The beginning of the war between the United States and Mexico in 1846 is also going to be the beginning of, well, the gathering storm. It's the beginning of traveling down the road that is going to lead ultimately to the Civil War. And that's because the beginning of that war with Mexico was the beginning of the arguments over what is going to happen in any new territory that is gained from Mexico during this war. And everyone knew that the whole goal of the war was to take certain areas away from Mexico. What's going to happen there? Will there be slavery there, or will there not? That is going to essentially, highlighted a few years later by some other things, dominate politics and dominate the news for roughly the next 13, 14 years. The political arguing began almost immediately, just 2 or 3 months into the 2-year-long war in the House of Representatives with something called the Wilmot proviso. Now, a proviso is something that is added to an agreement. A Wilmot, in this case, was Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, who was an anti-slavery Democrat. Now, the proviso, again, a proviso is something that's added. Wilmot added this onto essentially an appropriations bill, a $2 million appropriations bill to pay for the war. And this proviso that he added in was that no slavery would be allowed in any territory acquired from Mexico during this war. Now, that passed the House of Representatives 85-80, but then it failed the Senate. And of course, because it failed the Senate, it did not become, that proviso did not become part of the bill. But it is very significant that such a proposal from a Democrat also. Democrats tended to be friendlier to slavery, whether Northern or Southern Democrats than did the other parties. Anyway, the fact that it passed the House of Representatives was pretty significant. That shows how much division in thought and opinion there was on this subject. But now, this quote from Wilmot as he was defending his proviso is significant. Now, remember I said that Democrats, even in the North, tended to be more supportive of slavery in the South, perhaps, than abolitionists and others were. So here's what Wilmot had to say about this banning of the spread of slavery that he was proposing. Quote, "I have no squeamish sensitiveness on the subject of slavery, no morbid sympathy for the slave, but I stand for the integrity of the territory. It shall remain free so far as my voice and vote can aid in the preservation of its free character." Now, he is pointing out quite emphatically that just because he wants to stop the spread of slavery doesn't mean he feels sorry for black people, right? Because there's racism was the norm in the North as well as the South. And that would have been a politically unpopular stance to take. Remember, abolitionists were never in the majority anywhere in the North. They were frequently looked down on by other people in the region who did harbor those prejudices toward African Americans. So here Wilmot is saying, nah, don't get me wrong, don't think I like black people. But it's important that the territory be free and we preserve its free character. Now, what did that mean? The explanation of what that means is actually going to turn out to be pretty important when understanding what was going on politically, in the North especially, in these years of the gathering storm. Free soil, which as a concept is what David Wilmot was really talking about in 1846. Free soil was a philosophy that would eventually become the tenet of a new political party that would be founded in 1848, a party that was opposed to the spread of slavery. And when that party was formed in 1848, David Wilmot left the Democratic Party and joined the Free Soil Party, who unfortunately referred to themselves and were referred to as Free Soilers, which I say unfortunately, that's just because it kind of sounds like something from a diaper commercial. But that's what they call themselves. And their motto was free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. All those free things being tied in very closely together. Now, free labor, don't get confused about that. The Free Soilers were calling for free labor. That does not mean they supported slavery. I have students get confused on this on tests all the time. I ask them to explain free labor, and they say, oh, that's slavery. No, slavery is technically free labor, but it's not what we're talking about here. What the free soil proponents believed in was that it was very important to prevent the spread of slavery to new territories in the West. These new territories that would be gained, which very presciently they sort of foresaw was going to happen with this war. They wanted to make sure that that new territory, that there would be no slavery allowed in it at all, regardless of that line from 1820, that invisible horizontal line. And why did they want that? Well, Wilmot himself stressed he didn't want anybody to think that he felt sorry for black people or he liked black people. Perish the thought. No, there's another reasoning that they had, and that was that they were concerned about working class white people, particularly small farmers and also laborers. You see, if slavery were allowed to spread into new territories that the U.S. might gain, well, those new territories in that, the tradition of that Jeffersonian agrarian ideal, that would be new land opened up for individuals to claim that land and have their own small farms and become self-sufficient and independent. But if slavery were allowed, who's going to wind up with that land? It's going to be the wealthy plantation owners. They're going to wind up with that land. That's going to squeeze out small farmers from having the opportunity to better themselves. And it's going to squeeze out white labor, working class white people who would be working ordinarily on farms for a salary. Well, if slavery is allowed, there's going to be no call for that, right? Because it is more cost efficient for plantation owners to use slaves if they can, because there's that initial investment that they make, but they're not having to pay out a salary, right? And so slavery hurts working class white people. And that is what was motivating most of the people in the North who were opposed to the spread of slavery. Now, there was a lot of call for new and improved homesteading laws, which were already in existence since the time of Thomas Jefferson being the Secretary of State, in which, when new land is acquired by the U.S., it is public land owned by the federal government, and they can open it up to settlement. And these individual small farmers can come out, pioneers, right? That can't happen if there's slavery there. So this party was formed in 1848, the Free Soil Party, the first political party in the United States to have as the principal plank in its platform, the main thing that they stood for, to be opposing the spread of slavery. And they fielded a presidential candidate in 1848, former president of the United States, Martin Van Buren, who had previously been a Democrat and had even sort of like retooled and modernized the Democratic Party. His running mate was Charles Francis Adams. Charles Francis Adams was the grandson of John Adams and the son of John Quincy Adams. Now, I want you to stop and think for a moment and think back to when Andrew Jackson, whose running mate was Martin Van Buren, and Martin Van Buren was kind of his campaign manager, was running for president against John Quincy Adams. It was ugly, remember? John Quincy Adams and Martin Van Buren absolutely hated each other. And here's John Quincy Adams' son running on the same ticket with Martin Van Buren. Now, does that mean that they sort of poo-pooed and laughed off all that stuff that had happened 20 years before? Well, maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. But what's significant here is that two people who had sort of a family history of hating one another came together on this topic. That's how important this topic was to some people, not the majority of people, but some people. Now this leads into an even broader and historically much more important philosophy, free labor ideology. Free labor ideology. Remember that. Remember it if you're watching this for class because, it's on the study guide. But remember it in general. It is extremely important that you understand this ideology because it is going to become the foundation of the Republican Party, the modern day, the new Republican Party. Now, Thomas Jefferson's party had been called Republicans, and they'd also had been called Democrats, and eventually they kind of settled on the Democratic Party at the time of Andrew Jackson. The Republican Party, as we know it today, came about in 1854 when the Free Soil Party collapsed, and from its ashes, a new party that had broader appeal to more people was born, the Republican Party. Free labor, the same thing that we were just talking about, free labor not meaning slavery, free labor meaning free people doing the labor. All right, free people doing the labor. And essentially, you as a free person own your own labor. And you can market your labor. You can offer your labor to whomever you wish. Whoever offers you the best deal for your labor. And adherents to free labor ideology, which would include the early Republicans, believe that free labor is the basis of democracy, and that it is threatened, intrinsically threatened by slavery. This is not a case of being concerned about the immorality of slavery, the wrongness of it, or being concerned about the living conditions or the freedom of African American people who were enslaved. This is concern for working class white people, because where there's slavery, free white laborers can't get work. Even if they do get work, their wages are driven down because they're competing against slavery. Now, having just described that free labor, the basis of democracy, is where you own your labor and you can market it wherever you want, leads into this other tenet of free labor ideology, that everyone should have an equal opportunity to profit from their labor. Now, this is not a guarantee of an equal outcome, right? But an equal opportunity, an equal shot. Everyone should have a fair shot to profit from their labor. Maybe they won't. Maybe they won't because of circumstance. Maybe they won't because of markets. Maybe they won't because of bad luck. But they did have a shot. Everyone has a shot. And where there is true equal opportunity, where all the laborers are free, then hardworking individuals have the opportunity to move up the socioeconomic ladder. You can do well for yourself if you work hard, this philosophy says. And again, it's not a guarantee, but you do have a fair shot. And if you work hard enough, someday you can be your own boss, maybe even the boss of other people. So pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Now, perhaps you are aware, and perhaps you're not. If you're not, I'm about to tell you. But perhaps you are aware that the Republican Party of the mid-1800s, the Republican Party of the Civil War and Reconstruction, was what we today would call the Liberal Party. And it was the Democrats who were the conservative party. And in many ways, they were flipped from what they are today. In many ways. But this foundational thing about free labor ideology is something that still holds through in the official tenets of the Republican Party. Now, that doesn't mean every Republican politician has lived up to that, but theoretically, conservative ideals, as they are called today, and these Republican ideals of working hard and pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps and being your own boss goes all the way back to the beginning and being opposed to slavery. Now, there's a lot of other stuff that did change and kind of flip between the two parties, but this is how it started. So then, as a result of the free soil movement and of free labor ideology, as a result of that, all of a sudden, it was okay in the North to be opposed to slavery. Anti-slavery could be a respectable position to hold, as opposed to the way that anti-slavery had been treated before this, which was associated primarily with abolitionists, who were regarded often by the average white person in the North as wild-eyed radicals who wanted to end slavery in the South completely, and who argued using moral suasion, saying that slavery was immoral, that black people were not treated like human beings, and that was terrible, and it was immoral, and it was wrong. And there were many people in the North who felt that way, who had sort of that type of attitude, that were not popular with their neighbors, because most white people in the North did not feel that way. They carried deep prejudices against black people. Many of them didn't care what happened in the South because they weren't in the South. But once slavery gets attached to free labor ideology as something that is bad for working class white people, then all of a sudden David Wilmot can propose banning the spread of slavery, and he can say, hey, now hold on, don't think I like black people or anything, but no, it's got to be free. People understood that he was not protecting the rights of African Americans, which he really wasn't. He was protecting the rights of white laborers, and they were okay with that. So that's what was motivating Northerners during this time period, primarily. The desire to protect the situation of small independent white farmers and white laborers. Therefore, they were opposed to the spread of slavery. Southerners, white Southerners, had a very different set of priorities because they knew that if a bunch of new states were created and none of those states were allowed to have slavery, once they became states, they would have senators, they would have representatives, and that would just be that many more anti-slavery Congress people that the South would have to contend with. And after a short while, then the South would no longer have the votes that they had had for decades and decades that had enabled them to protect the institution of slavery. Once, say, 2/3 of the states were non-slave states, then you've got the votes in the House and the Senate to eventually impose the will of those 2/3 on the 1/3 and take away their, quote, peculiar institution. Peculiar not meaning strange when Southerners said it, peculiar meaning something that pertains only to us. If they took away slavery, that meant that all those cotton plantations, all those cotton planters would have to pay a salary to their laborers and therefore would make much less profit, which would endanger their whole way of life. Which on the one hand, that's true, that would endanger their way of life to the extent that they would no longer be able to live in the habits to which they were accustomed. Someone like John Quincy Adams would have said, good, they deserve that. But that's just the kind of attitude that Southerners were scared of. Therefore, they wanted to protect the institution of slavery, thereby protecting their profit system for cotton agriculture, and expand it so that they could maintain their political power to continue protecting it. On top of what we've already discussed, which is that they were over farming their cotton lands in the South, and they needed access to new lands for that reason. This set up the 1848 presidential campaign. The Democratic Party chose Lewis Cass as their candidate with William O. Butler as his running mate. The Free Soilers, as I mentioned, chose Martin Van Buren and Charles Francis Adams. The Whigs settled on Zachary Taylor as their candidate. Zachary Taylor, military general who had been one of the heroes of the Mexican War, had really absolutely no political experience whatsoever. And when I say no political experience whatsoever, it is believed he had never even voted, let alone ever joined a political party. What were his political beliefs? Well, your guess is as good as mine, really. He didn't really talk about them that much. This was really an effort to recreate Andrew Jackson, right? All the things people liked about Andrew Jackson, Zachary Taylor, old rough and ready, seemed to have, and a lot of the weaknesses, I guess you could say, of Jackson, he seemed to have as well. Now, Henry Clay had tried yet again to get the nomination for president. He had gotten it right multiple times and never really got anywhere. They decided he's had enough chances. He was very frustrated that Zachary Taylor got it. Frustrated because Henry Clay, of course, was a consummate politician who had been right there in the thick of things at this time for almost 40 years. And he said, I'm paraphrasing just slightly, he said, at what point did it make you qualified to become president that you were out in the woods so much you had moss growing on you? So he wasn't a sore loser. He was a sore loser. He wasn't a very a good loser there. Anyway, Zachary Taylor, his running mate, Millard Fillmore of New York. As you can see in the election, Taylor and Cass each got the same number of states. They both carried 15 states. Unfortunately for Cass, Taylor carried the bigger ones, which had more electoral votes. So Taylor was a clear winner in the Electoral College, and also a pretty clear winner overall in the popular vote, 47.3% versus 42.5%. So he won by 5 percentage points there. The Free Soilers, Martin Van Buren and the Free Soilers. Van Buren and the Free Soilers. Sounds like a really bad band. Anyway, they didn't win any states. They did, however, get 10% of the overall vote, 10.1%, which is a small minority, but it's not insignificant. Zachary Taylor assumed office in 1849, and not a whole lot really happened his first year, although the rapid population of California, due to the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in late 1848, led to a huge wave of people moving to California, which led to some interesting things after all in Taylor's second year in office. By 1850, California had enough people that they qualified to be a state, and so they applied for statehood. But there was a problem. Now, the Compromise of 1820, which had been brokered by Henry Clay, also called the Missouri Compromise, had come up with essentially a compromise that really satisfied nobody, so therefore it was perceived as the most fair. That would decide what areas could have slavery and what areas could not. Maybe you remember this discussion from earlier. Here in this map, this is the 1850 map. The states there in red are slave states, and the ones in blue are free states where slavery was not allowed. Now, several of those slave states were in existence before 1820. The Compromise of 1820 basically came up with that green line there, above which no slavery was to be allowed, but below which it could. The areas that already had slavery, including Missouri, this is part of the compromise, that were above that green line could keep it, but no one else could have it above the green line. And now California wants to be a state. Take a look at California out there on the West Coast. Do you see a potential problem? Well, that green line goes right through California. About 60% of the state is north of it, and about 40% is south of it. This is an issue. The people living in California, the vast majority of them, did not want slavery. And they also didn't want to break California up into 2 states. So once again, 30 years later, 30 years after that first compromise, Henry Clay comes forward with an idea to try to keep everything in balance and try to keep everybody as happy as possible, except for the slaves, of course. And his proposal was, okay, let's let California come in as a free state. Let us also end the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but not end slavery there. You can still have slaves, but no more. Well, really, it was embarrassing to the federal government that slave auctions were held, like practically across the street from the White House and the Capitol building, which visiting dignitaries had to watch. So let's do away with that, but still let there be slavery in D.C. Let's let the new territories taken from Mexico, let's let them decide on whether they want to be slave states or not. So this is going to do away with that green line. So any of these territories that want to become a state, the people who live there can vote on whether it's to be a slave state or a free state. That's called popular sovereignty. They get to vote for themselves, the citizens. Now, that's a lot of stuff there that is in the favor of anti-slavery people. California comes in as a free state. Slave trade ended in Washington. Popular sovereignty, on the one hand, might sound like it benefited slave owners because now there's every opportunity that new states above that green line can have slavery. But there's just as much chance that ones below the green line might now decide not to. And Southern politicians and Southern planters would much rather have, actually what they would rather have had is slavery be allowed everywhere, obviously. But barring that, they would have preferred that popular sovereignty not be a thing, that if you're below that green line, you have to be a slave state, period. So what did they get? What does the South get in this compromise? Well, what they got was an extremely strict fugitive slave law. Now, according to the laws already on the books, it's illegal for slaves to run away. And if a slave runs away from a slave state into a free state, like let's say New York, the owner of that slave theoretically, technically, has the authority to go try to catch him and bring him back. But that's a pretty big, it's a pretty tall order, really, as far as getting up there and blending in with the black population that lives there. This new slave law went beyond that. Not only could slave owners or someone designated by the slave owner, if their slave from Georgia ran away to New York, not only could they go to New York and try to find that slave, any citizen that was in the vicinity when they caught up to that slave, any citizen was required by law to help them catch and detain that slave. So this makes the retrieval of runaway slaves easier on the slave owners. It also is going to make slavery much more real to northern white people who in the past had been able to basically ignore it. Well, Zachary Taylor, old, rough, and ready. Now he's sitting there in the White House. He's kind of on the hot seat with this whole compromise thing that's being hammered out in Congress. Taylor was a Southerner. He was from Virginia, and he even owned slaves, but he was not particularly invested in spreading slavery westward. He was not ideologically committed to that. He was ideologically committed to just trying to get everybody to kind of get along, which was hard to do. It's hard to get everybody to get along when you have Texas. People in Texas resented the fact that New Mexico was now going to be a territory, which could potentially become a state, because they believed that New Mexico should become part of Texas, that they, as the Republic of Texas had claimed it, and that they should have it. And in fact, Texas was threatening to secede not that many years after they had come into the Union if they didn't get New Mexico. And Zachary Taylor, remember I said he was sort of viewed as like a substitute Andrew Jackson, showed his Andrew Jackson-like qualities because he threatened to lead an army personally to New Mexico if the Texans started anything, and just hang anybody that he could find. He said he would view it no differently than when he had hanged deserters during the war. Another issue was he, just like Andrew Jackson, he wasn't that fond of Henry Clay. So the fact that this was all Henry Clay's idea, this big compromise, failed to move Taylor to particularly invest himself in trying to get it done. So where is he gonna kind of point when it comes to this compromise? Well, as it turns out, it didn't matter because he died after 16 months in office in 1850. Reportedly, I think that there was a lot of dysentery, diarrhea involved. The old legend has it. This is not a legend. This part is fact. He loved him some cherries and ice milk. And for days, I think it was in the middle of summer, he had just been eating a copious amount of cherries, raw cherries, and ice milk. And then he got sick. And so a lot of people assumed that's what made him sick and made him die. But the doctors said that it was cholera, which was going around at the time. And most historians agree that probably it was cholera that finished him off. Millard Fillmore, the vice president, replaced Zachary Taylor as president of the United States. Fillmore had no particular problem with Clay or his compromise and signed off on it, and it became law. Now that Fugitive Slave Act that Southerners had been very happy about getting very quickly was going to backfire on them. Now, you're probably aware that there are a lot of people out there who will say that the Civil War was about states' rights, not about slavery. I will point out later in these lectures, that's not what Southern states were saying at the time. I would also point out, though, that if you believe that the Southern states had this ideological, philosophical attachment to protecting the notion that states should have the final say in what happens within their borders, not the federal government. If you believe that the Southern states who joined the Confederacy really were attached significantly to the idea of states' rights, I would point out a couple of things. First, I would point out that the only states' rights that they were interested in was their states' rights to have slaves. So if they really were deeply committed to the principles of states' rights, they would have been very happy that those Western territories, as a result of the Compromise of 1850, were going to have popular sovereignty, and the people who lived in the state were going to get to decide whether they had slavery or not. But they were not happy about that. They wanted the federal government to force all new states, preferably all new states, but at least all new states under that imaginary line, to have slavery. Where's the states' rights in that? And they were happy with this fugitive slave law that forced people living in northern states against their will to help catch fugitive slaves and return them into slavery, even if the vast majority of people living in that state didn't believe in that and didn't want to do that. They wanted to see the federal government force them to do that. Where is the states' rights in that? The South, like I said, they were for states' rights when it benefited slavery, and they were against states' rights when that benefited slavery. Now, I said that a lot of people in the North would not really be willing, certainly not eager, to help capture, in some cases, African Americans who had been living in their state for years and years, and essentially deport them to the South and slavery. in a lot of cases, they refused to do so, no matter what the new law said. A lot of free blacks, including those who had not only were not runaway slaves, but maybe had never been slaves, maybe they were born in freedom, still weren't that trusting that somebody might not just come along and say, hey, that's Joe, my slave from Alabama, and just capture them. A lot of them moved farther north into Canada. In fact, in 1854 in Boston, there was a riot in the streets when slave catchers tried to actually successfully did apprehend, an escaped slave named Anthony Burns, who had been living in Boston for several years. Not only did the white citizens of Boston not come to aid in the capture of this runaway slave, they did the opposite. They attacked the people who were trying to apprehend him. He was successfully apprehended along with another ex-slave named Thomas Sims. A crowd of hundreds, actually over 1,000 people converged on the courthouse to try to break them out. This also was unsuccessful. A policeman was killed during that. Then, as the two runaway slaves, were being conducted out of the city to be returned to slavery, they were under guard from the police and from the military, not to protect the slaves, but to prevent the slaves from being rescued by a crowd of 3, 4, maybe 5,000 people, all of whom were yelling their heads off, saying things like shame, shame, and probably other Boston things that we can't repeat here. They were not happy about this situation at all.